Hello everyone, this is Michael, and today we're going to discuss the cultural evolution of social institutions. As I pointed out before, the aim of this lecture series is to understand society, understand the problems that afflict that society, and think about possible solutions. And in order to understand our society, we must, as we've done last time, understand human social nature, but we must also understand the political structures of our society and how they came to be. And this is very much the subject of today's lecture. But before we get started, it's useful to have a small recap of what we said last time. And that was that what makes humans special is very much in-group cooperation. As we've seen, we've evolved a whole series of specific cognitive skills, but also emotional dispositions to enable us to cooperate extremely well in an extremely flexible, large-scale manner within groups, within the groups in which we live. So, like the leopard specialized in speed and the chameleon in camouflage, humans or Homo sapiens has specialized in cooperation. But we've also seen that these cooperative tendencies, that they evolved in a context of strong competition between groups. It's an adaptation to this context of strong group competition. Now, this we've seen has a very important consequence, namely that it co-evolved with this darker side of our social psychology, which is out-group hostility. And I've said we can kind of frame the whole of human history in the light of, through the lens of this evolved social psychology, all our greatest achievements through cooperation, but also this constant stream of very destructive group conflicts. Now, when it comes to those great achievements, I've said, well, they're very much the product of a very exceptional aspect of human cooperation, and that is that human cooperation is diachronical. We cooperate through time, we cooperate over generations, because we're wonderfully able to take over and learn and copy new kind of cultural skills, and take over new kind of cultural knowledge, and this creates a process of cumulative cultural evolution. The innovations, the knowledge we have in our groups generally tends to increase over time. We're building on the achievements of past generations. And so this aspect of cultural evolution is what we're going to talk about today. So how does culture evolve? Well, any evolutionary process is driven by the same kind of algorithm. It is driven by the same kind of steps. And these steps, well, there are three important steps. First of all, there's variation. Without any kind of variation, you cannot have evolution. You cannot have change, so there will not be evolution. If there wouldn't have been some kind of variation whenever life started here on Earth, well, we'd still be those first prokaryotic cells. That was what they were called. It was only because there were copying errors in how these cells reproduced themselves that there was variation in the first place, and that this diversity of living organisms and species could emerge. But variation by itself is not enough. For evolution to take hold, we also need replication. Without any kind of replication, well, change would just be completely idiosyncratic. Individual change would not be spreading through the group. So an individual organism could be different, but if that difference would not be given to the next generation, given to the offspring, would not be heredity, if there wouldn't be any heredity, well, we couldn't have any kind of evolution. And then finally, there's the very important point of selection, of course. Without selection, evolution would be random and there would be no direction in evolution. So let me give you a very simple example of how this works in biological evolution. Think about the giraffe. The neck of the giraffes got longer and longer over generations because there was a great adaptation to get to browse the leaves on the high acacia trees and some other stuff for which it was useful. But so how does that work? Well, first of all, there's random variation. One giraffe or a number of giraffes just by pure coincidence tend to have a slightly longer neck than the other giraffes in the population. Now, with that variation, there's replication. So those giraffes, which happen to have a kind of genetic mutation coding for a slightly longer neck, well, they gave those genes to the next generation. The next generation inherited their genes, so their offspring inherited their genes for a slightly longer neck, so they also had these longer necks, and there was selection. Giraffes with slightly longer necks, well, they had an advantage in terms of survival and reproduction over giraffes with shorter necks, so those giraffes got more food, they mated better, they had more offspring, and so in the next generation there were more giraffes with these longer necks than in the previous one, and so it keeps going, and so we get an adaptation that is emerging. Well, the very same thing is going to happen for cultural evolution. The reason why certain entities spread in culture is first of all because they emerged, there was variation. Secondly, because there was replication. And finally, because there was selection of these kind of traits. And this will become more clear in a minute. So how come there is evolution in human culture? We don't see evolution in the culture of other species, or at least not to the same extent. Well, first of all, humans are great in creating cultural variation. This follows from our cognitive flexibility. We can come up with new ways of doing things. We can introduce new kind of innovations and so forth. As we've seen, other species, other intelligent social species, have a similar ability to create cultural variation. Remember our chimpanzees using tools to get to food. We've said, well, this is not genetic behavior. This is very much some kind of cultural innovation. So that variation is also present in other kinds of populations. But where humans excel at, and which is crucial for a process of evolution, is that aspect of cultural replication. We're very, very skilled, as I said, in copying the behavior and the complex technical skills others in the group will display. Remember, our mirror neurons, they fire when we see somebody engaging in a complex technical skill, as if we're engaging in that skill ourselves. And this underlies the ease with which we can take over these various skills, in the ease with which we can copy these new skills, habits, etc. from others. And so we're very, very talented or skilled in replicating cultural variation. And then finally, and importantly, we have to ask ourselves, what drives cultural selection? Biological selection is driven by the chances a certain trait gives in terms of survival and reproduction to the organism which has this trait. When it comes to cultural selection, things get a bit more complex. We'll see that there are two different and equally important aspects that determine cultural selection. So we'll ask ourselves, now what drives cultural selections? So that basically is a question, why do certain kind of cultural variations thrive and others disappear? Now, cultural selection is driven by two distinct processes. The first is what I call internal selection. And the second then is called external selection. Now, internal selection happens because certain kind of cultural variations that we've created, that we stumbled upon, have a greater chance of being remembered and passed on by humans. I call it internal selection because the selection happens inside of our brains in a certain kind of way. Now the other selection process is external selection. Now some variations will thrive not because they are passed on by individual humans, remembered better and spread by humans talking about them, exhibiting these habits. That's a matter of internal selection. Now, some variations when it comes to external selection will thrive because they provide the group with an advantage over other groups which do not possess these variations. So these variations will make the group successful, and because of that success, these groups will expand, conquer, or influence other groups, and these variations will spread by this logic. So two distinct processes that are selecting cultural variations. Now, when it comes to internal selection, this is often referred to as mimetics in the literature. And the term memes was coined by Dawkins in his very important and groundbreaking book, The Selfish Gene, and it has been developed by other philosophers and social scientists since then. Well, they talk about memes in analogy with genes. So genes are the units of biological selection. It is what organisms pass on to other generations, and certain kind of genes, well, they will thrive. There will be many copies of those genes because those genes, like for instance the gene coding for long necks in giraffes, are very successful because they provide the organisms harboring those genes with an advantage in terms of survival and reproduction. Well, something similar, they say, is the case in cultural evolution. The only difference is that the units of selection are not genes, but memes. And these cultural units, if you will, use human brains to replicate. So much like genes in the biological realm use organisms to replicate, memes in the cultural realm use human brains to replicate. And they've been described as a kind of parasite using our brains. Think about this very catchy tune you hear on the radio and you can't get it out of your head. So you're humming it on the street. Not only has it infected your brain, but you're infecting other brains with it as well, because people hear you humming that very catchy tune, and before they know it, it's running in their head as well. They start to hum it. This would be a typical kind of case of mimetic replication. So some of these memes, some of these cultural units, they will be better at replicating themselves than others because they are more memorable. They're more intuitive. They're somehow psychologically more attractive to us. That's why I had the example of the very catchy tune. Well, some tunes are much more memorable to us. They're much more likely to be taken on, to be remembered, to be enjoyed perhaps, and so forth. And so these kind of memes, cultural units, well, they will be selected. People will spread them because they will remember them and they will communicate them in some way to others, thereby spreading it to other brains, which again will infect, if you will, if we take this kind of parasite metaphor, they will infect other brains. Now, good examples of cultural units being selected through this process are fashion. You know, the reason we wear certain kind of clothes, prefer certain kind of clothes that, as opposed to others, music, as I've already pointed out, or art in general. Well, these kind of cultural entities, well, they fit this account of internal selections in terms of mimetics very well. The reason, for instance, why Picasso paintings are so popular has a lot to do with the way our brain is wired, with our kind of sense of aesthetic. It stirs us in a certain way, it provides us with certain emotions and so forth. So that is why these pieces of art are so famous, perhaps more famous than other paintings which are less beautiful in some kind of way. So this is the very first important aspect of cultural selection. Selection here happens in human brains, and certain kind of cultural variations are just more attractive to us and therefore will spread in the groups in which we live. But as I said, there's also a very different kind of selective process at work. And this other kind of selection, this other selective process is external selection. Now, there can be cultural variations that will increase the success of the group. And they can do so because they provide the group with more wealth, different kind of technologies. They can do so because they will increase the social cohesion within that group, increase the cooperation within that group. And so these kind of cultural variations, and this can go from, successful new technologies to political structures, which we'll discuss mainly today, social institutions, political structures that foster cohesion, cooperation, and so forth. Now, these kind of cultural variations, they are selected because they provide the group with an advantage. And because of that advantage, the group will become successful and it will expand at the expense of less successful groups. So it will get the upper hand in the competition over scarce resources. Remember the context of group competition we've talked about. We've got people from less successful groups which are likely to migrate to more successful groups. So the less successful groups, they will ultimately disappear. And the more successful groups, they will not only become bigger, but they will likely form satellite groups. And these satellite groups will take on these successful cultural variations, the cultural variations that underlie the success. So these cultural variations, they will spread through the human population because of the success they give to the groups harboring those cultural variations. But also, those successful groups, well, they will conquer less successful groups when there's a direct conflict. So again, the successful groups will remain, will expand, will thrive. The less successful groups will disappear. And then finally, there's quite a bit of imitation between human groups. Less successful groups, we've seen throughout history, will imitate more successful groups, which actually amounts to the fact that they will take on the cultural entities that underlie the success of these groups. And so again, these cultural entities will spread throughout the human population. Now, because they provide the groups possessing these cultural variations with an important advantage over groups not possessing them. And so, when it comes to the cultural evolution of certain social institutions, and this relates to the paper you had to read for this lecture, the paper on universal cultural institutions, or universal social institutions, well, we have to invoke both kinds of selection processes. On the one hand, there's the internal selection of these kind of social institutions. They are a good fit with human nature. Borders, for instance, well, they're a good fit with, human psychology, which is territorial, like that of many other social species, or at least up to a certain extent. People have always been fighting and bickering over territories, even as hunter-gatherers. Those were the hunting territories where they're gathered and so forth. So borders follow naturally out of that. Marriage, which is another universal social institution I discussed in the paper which you had to read, but we're not going to discuss today. But obviously this fits very well with this account of internal selection. Marriage follows from the normal coupling behavior that all species and also humans exhibit. And then property follows quite naturally out of what we call the endowment effect in psychology, the fact that we're going to value a lot those things that we possess. We're going to value them more than things we do not possess. So we'll go to greater lengths to keep these kind of possessions. So property would follow out of that. But as I argued in the paper you had to read for this lecture, well, there's actually more to the story of why certain social institutions are universal social institutions, meaning that all societies today possess them, or almost all societies today possess them in some form or another. In order to explain the universality of certain important social institutions, we also have to take into account this process of external selection. And in the paper, I'm not talking about this internal selection and external selection. This is something I came up with later, but I think it's a very clear way to frame what actually what I'm talking about and how cultural evolution works. But so the terminology you won't find in the paper, but it's very much this that I explain in that paper, that we should also take into account this process of external selection. Certain social institutions, well, they have thrived, they have become universal, not only because they fit our psychological nature well, but also, perhaps even more importantly, because they organize a group in a very efficient way. They make the group better off. They give an advantage to groups possessing these social institutions over groups not possessing these social institutions. And so, as I've just said in the previous slide, well, because of that advantage, the successful groups, well, they will expand, they will conquer the other groups, they will be imitated by other groups. So the less successful groups with their less successful social structures disappear, and the more successful groups with these very efficient social structures, social institutions, well, they will thrive and they will multiply. So what is the logic behind the external selection of the universal social institutions? And universal social institutions we'll discuss here, and which are also discussed in the paper, are property, the management of common resources or goods, and criminal law. So the question we have to ask ourselves is not only how do these social institutions kind of fit with our social nature, something I've already pointed out to a certain extent, but also, but even more importantly, how did they make the group more successful, and how were they, in this context, externally selected? Well, the answer to that question is that they solve the problem of cooperation. And we've talked about that problem of cooperation in the last lecture. It's also called the free rider problem. Remember, we're all better off when we cooperate, when we altruistically cooperate, but the major problem is how can we protect this cooperation against free riders? Because somebody profiting from this cooperation of others but not doing anything in return would have an advantage over those altruistic cooperators, and so therefore he would, within these groups, soon outcompete these cooperators and cooperation would vanish. Now, we've seen how our social instincts have solved this problem of cooperation within the groups. Today, we're talking about how our social institutions will solve these problems of cooperation in the much larger groups that emerged after the agricultural revolution. Remember, before the agricultural revolution, we lived in groups of about 150 people on average. That's Dunbar's number, we've discussed that. And the way we maintained cooperation and cohesion within those groups was by extensive reputation tracking and punishing those free riders and other sociopaths which put their own interests in front of the group's interests. Now, this very successful way of maintaining cooperation and cohesion in these small hunter-gatherer bands was useless in the much larger groups that emerged after the agricultural revolution. Because now we're living in groups not of 150 individuals, we're living in groups of first thousands and thousands of individuals, and then tens of thousands of individuals. So in those huge agricultural settlements, those first cities, and they would only increase in size, well, we couldn't protect cooperation in this way, because many of the interactions that were taking place now were between complete strangers. There was no reputation tracking in place, and so forth. So the major problem that emerged after that agricultural revolution is, how can we maintain social cohesion and how can we prevent free riding in these much, much larger groups? Now, the solution to that important problem came in the form of social institutions. More precisely, in the form of those social institutions I've already mentioned, institutions like property, criminal law, and the management of common resources or common goods. But first, it is useful to get a better grip on this problem of cooperation, or the free rider problem. Now, the problem of cooperation is modeled in game theory by the famous prisoner's dilemma, which you may have heard of. It's the most famous game in game theory, and it models this problem of cooperation. Now, the story goes as follows. There are two members of a gang and they're arrested for a crime. Now, the prosecutor interrogates them separately in different cells. And he gives the following choice to both gangsters. If you betray the other and the other one doesn't betray you, you go free, I don't have any charges against you, and the other one will serve 3 years in prison. If you both betray each other, well, you both will serve 2 years in prison. If you both remain silent, well, you both serve 1 year in prison, because I don't have any major kind of case against any of you. Now, that's a very important problem, because as you'll see, if both gangsters will act rationally and out of self-interest, they will get to a situation which is undesirable for the both of them. And this should be clear from the following matrix. So if you read the following matrix, and don't worry about the technicalities of it, I won't ask you to reproduce any kind of matrix and read these matrix off in the exam, but I think it shows us really neatly how the problem, or what the structure of this problem is. So if you read this payoff matrix, you see that when you're in the upper left corner, where they both cooperate, both gangsters cooperate, they just each get 1 year in prison. When you're in the down left corner or the upper right corner, well, there's one player, or one gangster in this case, which goes free because he betrayed the other and wasn't betrayed in return, and the other one has 3 years in prison, the -3. In the right corner down, we've got the situation in which they both betray each other and they each get 2 years in prison. Now, in game theory, there's this concept of the Nash equilibrium. And John Nash, you may know him from the movie The Beautiful Mind, but actually don't go watch this movie and look at the way they try to explain a Nash equilibrium, because they don't explain it accurately. I'll try to do a better job here. So this John Nash, well, he kind of developed the mathematics of game theory, and he found out that there's a point in most of these games in which the outcome will automatically gravitate, and that is the Nash equilibrium. Now, a Nash equilibrium is reached when all the players two players in this case, have a best response given the strategy of other players. That means that in a Nash equilibrium, no player can improve his payoff by changing his strategy. And if we look at this payoff matrix, it should be clear that the upper left corner, where they both go 1 year in prison, cannot be the Nash equilibrium. Why? Because both players can improve their payoff by changing their strategy. That is, by betraying the other instead of cooperating and getting 0 years in prison instead of 1 year in prison. So the Nash equilibrium is the very suboptimal state in which they both betray each other, in which they both are sentenced to 2 years in prison. If they act rationally, maximizing their own personal payoff, and if they act without any knowledge of what the other will do, well, they will, and the latter doesn't even matter, they will always have an advantage over betraying the other. If the other betrays them as well, they get 2 years in prison instead of 3. If the other does not betray him, well, the player gets 0 years in prison instead of 1. So it is always beneficial to betray your fellow gangster. And this is very much the problem of cooperation. While both players would be much better off if they cooperated, if they didn't betray each other in the prisoner dilemma game, and they're in the upper left corner with just 1 year in prison, the game, if the players are acting rationally and out of self-interest, will automatically gravitate towards the suboptimal situation in which they both betray each other, because, very simply put, it is always better for a player to betray the other one. So link it with the problem of cooperation or the free rider problem. While cooperation within the group would be beneficial to all, well, if nothing happens, if we're in a prisoner dilemma situation, we will never get to cooperation. We will always get to free riding, to complete lack of cooperation, because free riding is always better for any given individual within the group. If the others are cooperating and you're just the only one free riding, well, that's great. Best possible payoff. You're not paying any of the costs and you're receiving all of the goods. If they're also free riding, well, it's obviously better not to cooperate, but also to just free ride. The payoff is still better than if you would pay any costs for that kind of cooperation. So much like betraying in a prisoner dilemma, free riding in a cooperative group context is always beneficial for the individual. So it's very hard to get to this desirable cooperative upper left corner, although that would be by far the best situation for all the individuals within the group. So how can we solve this cooperation problem? And we've actually discussed that without invoking any of the game theory in last lecture. How can we solve the free rider problem? How can we move the game from the suboptimal betray matrix to the optimal cooperate matrix in the left upper corner? Well, the answer very simply is punishment. Remember, this is how cooperation within groups can emerge and can be maintained. If we punish betrayal, if we punish free riding, well, we change the payoff matrix and we make it so that the free riding strategy is now no longer preferable to the cooperative strategy, whatever the other one does. This is what our social instincts did in the small groups in which we lived before the agricultural revolution. This is also what the social institutions will do in the large agricultural groups in which we came to live. What they do is they change the payoff structure of the social game we're playing with each other. They harshly punish any kind of free riding strategy, which makes it no longer attractive as an individual strategy to maximize your payoff. And therefore, they enable the game to move to the group desirable left upper corner in which all parties cooperate. And so they've done that for these universal social institutions. And in the paper you had to read for this lecture, while I work out the game theory, and so you can kind of see it in detail. I won't go over all of the details here. As I said, the technicality of game theory is not so important, but I thought it would be very useful to provide you with this important tool in the social sciences to model all of these interactions. And this is very much game theory. But so quickly, well, when it comes to property and criminal law, well, in a pre-institutional context, many will take resources not by producing or by trading them, but by force or by ruse. And so we actually see this in context of, for instance, civil war, where the rule of law completely breaks down, like in certain regions, for instance, of the Congo over the last decades. We see that they're terrorized by raiding parties, just groups of militants, armed groups, which go from village to village and just, take all of the resources and make a living like that. And this is very much the situation we're in when there's no rule of law and property is not being enforced and sanctioned, and there's no criminal law that prevents them from, harming people within the group. And so the result of such a situation is obviously disastrous. First of all, there's much less resources for the whole group, because now instead of everybody contributing in some kind of way to produce or trade something, trade services for goods and so forth, we got a portion of the population that just takes but doesn't produce anything. And obviously, perhaps even more importantly, that introduces a whole lot of conflict in the group, which is detrimental for the group and for most individuals within that group. So in this kind of pre-institutional context, when there's no property and criminal law being enforced, it's kind of the law of the jungle, if you will, we're very much in this Nash equilibrium of a prisoner dilemma game. We're in the down right corner with the very undesirable payoff. But in an institutional context, we are going to harshly punish people who take resources by force or ruse. And so therefore, this strategy will no longer be very attractive. The result is that everybody, that's a bit wishful thinking, but most people will refrain from adopting these, you could say, hawk-like strategies, and people will start producing. So the pie will become larger, there will be more to be distributed, there will be less conflict, and the whole society will be better off. So before the agricultural revolution, everybody was keeping an eye on everybody, and everybody was keeping everybody in check. And if there was a kind of sociopathic individual putting his own self-interest in front of the group, being very aggressive towards the group, the whole group turned against this person. This person was banished or killed. And so the cohesion and the cooperation within the group was maintained. After the agricultural revolution, where much more people were in these groups, there's much less the possibility of checking people's reputation, keeping people in check. These kind of social control mechanisms started to fail because the groups were way too large for these mechanisms to maintain and protect cooperation and cohesion. So we need top-down set of rules, and we need to enforce these rules. We need a policing force that will punish people who do things that go against the interests of the group. And this is very much what we see happening in all these agricultural societies. Hunter-gatherers don't have property laws, they don't have any kind of explicit criminal law, but all of these laws, first they were obviously not written, but then soon they were written down, emerged in these large agricultural groups and are still very much the foundations of human societies today. Now, another important aspect that needs regulation is common resources or common goods, like drinking waters in arid regions, pastures, grazing pastures for pastoral, you have pastoral groups, fish stock for fisher communities, and so forth. In order to prevent what Garrett Hardin called a tragedy of the commons, the use of these common resources must be regulated. Now, why is this? Well, when there's a kind of common resources that is at the disposal of everybody within the group, well, when individuals act independently in their self-interest, they will predictably deplete or destroy the common resource at the detriment of all. Let me give an example that was also given by Hardin when he came up with this kind of theory about the tragedy of the commons. Well, imagine 10 shepherds on a pasture that can sustain 100 sheep. Now, at this point, they each have 10 sheep, so the pasture is used at full capacity by 100 sheep. But I'm one of these 10 shepherds, and I'm thinking, well, what would happen if I add another sheep to my flock? Well, this would obviously be great for me because I would have 10% more wool to sell on the market. The only downside is slightly less food for my other 10 sheep. But this kind of cost will not weigh up against the benefits I could have by introducing a new sheep on the pasture. The reason is that the costs, the slightly less food there will be available for the sheep, because there's now one more sheep feeding from that pasture, is shared by all of the shepherds. But the benefit I stand to gain is not shared. It's individual. It's 10% more wool for me to be sold on the market. So if all of these shepherds reason from an individual perspective and try to maximize their payoff, well, they will predictably add more and more sheep to their stock over the capacity of the pasture, which ultimately will lead to the demise of their common resource, the demise of this pasture. All of the grass will be eaten and all of the sheep stand to die, and everybody is much, much worse off. The problem of a tragedy of the common situation is that the costs are shared by the group and the benefits are reaped individually. And there are many tragedy of the common situations. One that we're very well aware of now is a global tragedy of the commons when it comes to climate change. Now, we all, as a human population, would benefit from curbing the emission of greenhouse gases. Because of climate change, we'll be all better off in the long term if we enable to control our CO2 emissions and other greenhouse gases. But individually, we stand to gain much by not taking the necessary precautions now at this time, because that requires enormous investments. That requires perhaps stopping some polluting industry, which are very lucrative at this point. And so this is a tragedy, a contemporary tragedy of the commons situation. Now, such a tragedy of the commons is very much the same kind of problem as a prisoner dilemma. Now, all of the people using the commons would be much better off if they're in the upper left corner, if everybody just uses the common resources in a very responsible way. But every single individual using the common resource will benefit by not doing so, by actually taking more than his or her fair share of that common resource. And so we get to this undesirable Nash equilibrium again in our prisoner dilemma game, in which we're not cooperating and in which we're all much worse off. So again, how can we solve such a problem of cooperation? How can we solve the tragedy of the commons? Well, very simply by punishing free riding, by regulating the use of this common resource and punishing any kind of infraction, and so therefore not making it attractive anymore for people to use more than their fair share of the common resource, and moving the Nash equilibrium to the cooperative upper left corner. that is very much what the regulation of common resources does. There are common resources in all societies, in all human groups, and everywhere they are regulated, they're harshly monitored, and people making infractions on the regulated use of these common resources are being punished or penalized. That's the only way to protect these common resources. And these are efficient, universal social institutions that enable us to move to the cooperative upper left corner. So that's it for the question how cooperation and cohesion was maintained in these much larger groups that emerged after the agricultural revolution. But just like last time, we must also say something about this other very important question, which is why did these solutions, these social institutions, why did these emerge in these groups? Why were they selected? And we've already addressed that question in the beginning of the lecture. Now we're going to think about the consequences of that. So we said, well, these social institutions, they were culturally selected. They were on the one hand internally selected because they fit well with our human social nature, but perhaps more importantly, they were also externally selected because they gave an advantage over groups possessing these social institutions over groups not possessing these social institutions. So they gave an advantage to groups in a context of group competition. So the architect of cooperation, the architect of these social institutions that enhanced or protected that cooperation in this new societal context after the agricultural revolution, is still very much the same architect as the one that shaped our social psychology and our social instincts. It is competition, more precisely competition between groups. And much like that had important consequences for our social instincts, as we've seen, the consequence was that we didn't only evolve the capacity and the disposition to cooperate extensively within our groups, but also the strong disposition to limit that cooperation at the borders of the group and even be hostile towards members of other groups. Well, something very similar is the case when it comes to the cultural selection of our social and political structures in this new societal context. Social institutions were not only selected to promote in-group harmony, but also to limit that cooperation to the group and even to increase hostility towards other groups or towards members of other groups. Another social institution that emerges everywhere after the agricultural revolution. So first we see it in the Middle East, the Fertile Crescent, where the agricultural revolution first took place. Then we see it in Asia, then in South America. Wherever humans settle down, start working the land, their group sizes increase massively. They get a whole bunch of rules inside the groups to keep cooperation and cohesion within that group, but they also start to build borders around their settlements, and those were physical major borders. Now, that's something we see happening everywhere after the agricultural revolution, and it makes a lot of sense from the story I've been telling, because borders are a wonderfully efficient means to, first of all, keep cooperation within the group, and then secondly, also to protect against the hostility of other groups. What we also see, for instance, are what they call group markers. People starting to dress themselves in certain ways that really show to which kind of group they will belong. Now, another very interesting thing is what happens with religion after the agricultural revolution. Now, as far as we know, humans, biologically modern humans, have always had certain kind of religious or rather supernatural beliefs, but religions go through a major metamorphosis after the agricultural revolution. Now, the typical hunter-gatherer religions are animistic religions. They infuse the whole of their environment with, spiritual essences, and they have rituals to engage with those supernatural entities, be it ancestor or some kind of spirits. They do rain dances to get rain and so forth. But there's a crucial and important difference between those animistic religions and the typical religions, like the Abrahamic religions, like Hinduism, like Buddhism, if you can call it a religion, that we see today. And that crucial difference is that these hunter-gatherer animistic religions, that they are not moralistic religions. They don't typically have moral rules that are imposed on people and that orchestrate the way people should interact with one another. Morality came rather late into religion, and now it's a core feature of most of these religions. Think about Christianity, Islam, Judaism, with the 10 Commandments that are in the Old Testament, and a whole set of moral directives that you find in these religions. The same goes for Hinduism, for Buddhism, and for other religious traditions emerging in agricultural kind of context or post-agricultural context. Now, these religions, they emerged, or they evolved to integrate this moralistic aspect, because that was an extremely efficient means to promote in-group harmony and solidarity and cooperation. Now you have this divine kind of punisher and monitor that watches over the behavior of all individuals, and you will be punished in hell for an eternity to come if you break some of these rules. That's a wonderfully efficient means to keep people in check. So these religions, they were culturally selected, externally selected to a certain extent, because they provided the groups that possessed these kind of religions with a major advantage in terms of in-group cooperation, in-group harmony, social cohesion, and so forth. But these religions, well, they also, and this is also a crucial difference with animistic religions, for the first time started to promote out-group intolerance and hostility. The community with which you're supposed to be in much solidarity, at least originally in those religions, if you read the Old Testament, for instance, well, it's very much your religious community. When it comes to interactions and relations with members of other groups with different kind of religions, very often, not only is there some kind of inbuilt intolerance, but sometimes even, actively promoting hostility towards those groups. And so our history has been filled since then with conflicts that were inspired by religious motives. And the result of this cultural infrastructure emerging after the agricultural revolution is that larger and larger groups could emerge, and the cooperation and the cohesion within these larger groups could be maintained. So in-group cooperation was scaled to massive levels, but also out-group conflict was scaled. And so we see an evolution towards larger and larger groups that are on a footing of war, or at least hostility or suspicion with one another. And this would culminate in the 20th century, where you have a kind of polarization of conflict. We've seen it in the First and the Second World War. We've seen it in the Cold War, in which the whole of the world population is kind of divided in two major groups that are opposed to each other. Groups that comprise almost the entire human population. But again, there is more to our story. Some 150 years ago, technology, for the second time in human history, would radically alter the fabric of our societies. The first time it did so was, as I just mentioned, with the agricultural revolution. Now this time we see very different kind of technologies altering our society, and those technologies are transport and communication technologies. And because of those technologies, people, goods, and streams of information, ideas, and so forth are no longer contained within the groups in which they emerged. The consequence is that groups are no longer independent of one another. We've entered the age of globalization, and this has very, very important consequences for our society and the major challenges of our societies. We see this interdependence in a number of different ways. We see it in the economy or in the economic context, where economies of nations are extremely interdependent of one another. And so we've seen in 2008 with the subprime crisis that became a global economic crisis, that actually just emerged in the US, and not in the entire economy in the US, but in the housing market of the US, where they were having these subprime credit loans to house owners which couldn't repay those loans and so forth. Now this very local kind of economic crisis would spread through the whole world, because all the economies are so interdependent and depend so much on what happens in other economies. We also see it in politics. Well, in order to address problems like conflict, poverty, or at least in order to maintain harmony within any groups, well, conflict and poverty in other groups must also be controlled, because they affect all of the groups, all of the nations on Earth, because massive conflicts and massive poverty in a globalized world leads to massive migration streams, which again will destabilize societies. We've seen this very clearly with the Syrian civil war, which brought about an extreme migration stream to neighboring countries, but also to Europe and other regions of the world. And we see it more and more with economic migrants to the richer regions of this earth. It's a stream that is only starting, and that will very likely increase in size in the following decades, because in a world that is made very accessible through transport technology, well, it is very logical that people will try to migrate to much richer regions, and we'll see how much that can destabilize societies. We also see it in the context of health very much today in these months with the spread of the coronavirus, a virus that just emerged in a province in China, but in the span of a few months would conquer the whole world. So the major problems we are facing today are thoroughly global problems. And this sets the stage for our upcoming lectures and discussions. So in the coming lectures, we'll talk about the global problems that face us. We'll talk about climate change, poverty, overpopulation, migration, and conflicts, and how they're all linked. And we'll also discuss the current corona pandemic. And we'll discuss how these are thoroughly global problems requiring, and this is the last part, global solutions. So in the last two lectures, we'll think about these global solutions. We'll look at how we can get to efficient global cooperation in the face of these problems. So that's it for the theoretical framework. I hope it provided you with a new and better understanding of human societies. And with this framework in place, we can start thinking about actual problems and solutions. Looking forward to discussing that with you.